In the 4th chapter of St. John, we have this wonderful encounter with the woman of Samaria, and towards the end of this discourse we have this insistence of the way in which God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Well, this is our affair. We are looking in concrete terms as creatures of the way in which the creaturely side of our being renders a spiritual praise. Liturgy involves that double dynamic, expression outwardly of an internal reality. The internal reality must be the motive force of the other, and it must be present if the other is to be an authentic expression. Otherwise it becomes an end in itself and can even be an empty shell. This has been picked up by all those who have written over the centuries about the question of liturgy, and we look this morning at what Pope Benedict XIV has to say. He was reigning from 1740 to 1758. So it's a period of consolidation. The work of the Council of Trent is long complete, and also the application has happened through the impetus also given by the Counter-Reformation. And so we have here a time of consolidation. This Pope, Benedict XIV, was actually a prolific writer on liturgical matters, unexpectedly so. The edition of papal teachings on the liturgy, compiled by the monastery of Solesmes, which of course specializes in things liturgical, cites no fewer than 16 documents. These would be concerned with the reform of sacred music. Of course, that would be of concern to Solesmes. The reception of Holy Communion from hosts consecrated at the same Mass. That was taken up much later in time by Pope Pius XII in Mediator Dei in the late 40s, therefore before the Second Vatican Council. And the document does insist on authenticity on such points as the significance of the consecration. It is not correct liturgical practice to consecrate only the host of the celebrant and go into the tabernacle for the communion of the faithful. There ought to be always hosts consecrated at the Mass itself for the people, at least representatively so. And indeed, in the teaching given by Pope Benedict, Sacramentum Caritatis, he is keen that there should be some share in the priest's host itself by one or two present. That can happen, for instance, for the server or whoever is nearest, and this would be indicative of the notion of the breaking of the bread, which is the expression that we have coming from the Acts of the Apostles, fractio panis, and on which St. Paul comments when writing to the Corinthians. There is unity expressed therein. The notion then of going into the tabernacle, for instance, on a weekday, is an aberration one can quite easily consecrate roughly the number of particles needed and a few more just to make sure, and go only into the tabernacle with those left over rather than before to take those that are really not necessary. Hence it is that is linked with another abuse which has come in recent times of multiplying the number of posts of distribution in the church physically without necessity. It takes away from the sign of unity. The notion of receiving what has been consecrated, and that the mensa, the table of the Lord, is completely broken when one makes appeal to an earlier celebration by going to the tabernacle without necessity. And when it happens that it is done partly to satisfy the itch of whoever it might be, to be of use to the people of God, but indirectly as a means of self-gratification, if one is honest, because one likes to be useful and seen, then one questions what is the order of priority. This notion of going to the tabernacle when there are only a few people present, or even as far as 50 or 80, is really to be looked at. And if already 50 years after the council it is still there, it means that the renewal has not been successfully applied or even understood. So this could be easily addressed even on a parish level with a bit of catechesis thrown in. The dynamics of the Holy Mass come from those of the upper room, and we didn't see the Lord inviting all kinds of other people to speed up the operation. There was calm there. So if the bottom line is hurry, 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 we've got to get out of church, then we're doomed to miserable liturgy. Why are we in such a hurry to come to the altar of our God, who has been waiting for us calmly in his eternal silence, not looking at his watch? So this has been gone into time and again. We have it clearly here in the teaching of Pope Benedict XIV in the mid-1740s. And then we have his teaching in other documents on the general decency and cleanliness of churches and of everything associated with worship. St. Norbert, who was very much a Eucharistic saint, he's presented with the monstrance in his hand, he insisted on three things in the communities that he founded. Cleanliness in all that pertain to the altar and the things of God. Hospitality, his houses had to be warm and welcoming. And the correction of faults, notably in the chapter of faults, so as to maintain the external discipline as a safeguard of the internal one. But this has always been perceived by those in his ambit, and in the tradition of Prémontré, the Premonstratensian tradition, splendor is given unto God. Indeed, in our own abbey at St. Antimo, we had maintained the notion of the Missa Summa, which is still the case in good houses, that the High Mass, Missa Summa, is very much the centre of the 24 hours, and nothing is spared. It went on for a long time, it was fully sung, even the Eucharistic prayer. It was incense every day, and all the stops were pulled out to give God glory and splendour. And the people perceived it. It is in itself a great catechesis, giving people a sacred space, an opportunity in which God can act, and which man is free then to enter so as to be available to God. heaven and earth meet more easily in serene spaces. And therefore time is the last determining issue. Yet this same Pope, interestingly, did reject the possibility of inculturating the Roman liturgy to incorporate Chinese traditions. This is the famous quarrel of rites, the dispute over rites. The Congregation of Rites had to look into the question of use of ancient cultural rites in the atmosphere, tending to be used a little bit, perhaps too much, they thought, by the missionaries, notably the Jesuits, who were very good at mission work and knew the importance of taking what was there, as did St. Patrick actually in Ireland. But they were taking on a lot, and it was something which made Rome a little hesitant, and then this Pope had to determine and warn that one had to be careful, because the parts coming in could be contaminated by the beliefs of which they were an expression. That, of course, applies in our day. If we take on too much in an indistinguished form from what is coming out of the local culture, a good example would be the profane in the realm of music. And of course we have other things, not liturgical, but certainly involved in things which go on in some parish centres, coming from New Age. Yoga, Reiki, practices which are of an Eastern origin and which may be precisely contaminated by carrying some of that spirituality and therefore ethos and indeed divinities, whatever it might be, linked with that, including precisely the wrong side. So one has to be discerning. Hence we understand the Pope's reaction to taking on too much without discernment. He was a forward-looking and forward-thinking Pope, and he also acted upon the breviary, at least by a projected reform, prompted to some extent by the Gallican reforms that we've been looking at over the past couple of weeks or so. He appointed a commission in 1741, which, at its outset, considered two requests made to him. One was to give the breviary a new form. The other was to purge the existing breviary of errors, particularly historic problems coming from a lack of discernment in transmitting texts which were old but which were not historically accurate. So, particularly the historical errors. I've mentioned before how in the traditional structure of the Roman breviary, when there is a feast of any importance, there would be 3 nocturnes, and the second nocturne would have readings after the Psalms, and these would be quite often of the life of the saint. And this was the problem. Those were transmitted from old times without sufficient care for historical accuracy. It was felt that it was sufficient to be edifying. Well, it had to also be true, to be really edifying. And I mentioned before how it became proverbial in France in the expression mentir comme un second nocturne, to lie as a second nocturne. So this had to be pruned, he felt. So he emphasized that the existing breviary comprised certain essential elements which could not be modified without destroying the Roman rite itself. The Commission accepted this. Their first task was reform of the calendar, once again overgrown to the detriment of the seasons. I remember hearing way back in the 60s from a school friend of mine. We were still more or less children, 12, 13, that kind of age, but he was a practicing High Anglican, and he had heard from someone in his family that at the changes in the calendar, that is by Paul VI, there had been quite a few saints who had been, as it were, put aside. And he told me, I haven't been able to verify it, but he told me that he'd heard that there was the statue of one saint who had suffered this that actually wept. I'd love to be able to know whether it was actually true or not, and which saint it was. Maybe it was somebody like Christopher, St. Christopher, who was very popular in the Middle Ages, but suffered a casualty there when it came to the reform of the calendar. Indeed, in our abbey in Italy, if one was coming from the cloister door into the abbey church, the first thing that one saw was a fresco opposite on the column of St. Christopher. It was a church where pilgrims would come on the way to Rome. They were on the Via Francigena, and it was one of the points where they would call to venerate St. Antimo and St. Sebastian, and the relics would be under the present high altar, in another altar under, in the crypt, in the confessionale, and there the church, you can see it, was built so that there'd be a circuit of praying going on. But of course they'd come and they'd be keen on having protection for pilgrims from St. Christopher. And so it was in many, many, many churches in the Middle Ages. Now, the question then was that of maintaining the structure, but pruning what had to be pruned. Benedict XIV's personal wish was not for a reform of the existing breviary, but for a newly constructed breviary. In a private letter written in 1743, he looks forward to a breviary in which everything should be drawn from Holy Scripture, and the most universally accepted writings of the most ancient fathers. Saints, other than those in these categories, would be merely commemorated. In effect, the Pope expressed a desire for a radical departure from Roman liturgical tradition that would canonize the principles behind the Gallican reform. In September of 1744, the Pope had changed his mind and publicly accepted the Commission's principle to work on the reform and not the recasting of the breviary. Two months later, he and the Commission's secretary, Valenti, are on record as accepting the same view. One proposal made to the Commission in 1745 was rejected on the grounds on the grounds of the operative principle of reform. So, Valenti articulated the principle thus: that which is from antiquity is retained, and that which is new is reprobated. That is, it is best to change nothing. This principle was not, however, seen as preventing the Commission from expunging historically false documents in the lessons of Matins, or as preventing a new reform of a calendar, as had been done by St. Pius V. He's the one, of course, who was at work in the promulgation of the office and the liturgy of the Council of Trent. By Eastertide of 1747, Benedict XIV had the finished project on his desk. Clearly, the traditional Roman breviary with a radically reformed calendar, that was what he was projecting. What happened? He died 11 years later without promulgating any reform. He judged the finished work of the Commission inopportune. So, we have the judgment of historians. Was it for good or for bad that it wasn't promulgated? Batifol, who's a great expert, suggests that the radically reformed calendar was itself not beyond question. So, there we are, the question of such and such a saint who might feel sidelined, and that the attendant difficulties of such a reform caused the Pope to hold back. He could see a huge unsettling, I suppose, of the prayer life of the Church. The quasi-Gallican views expressed by the Pope in 1743 may also have been a factor. So he would have been seen as supporting that independent spirit of France. In the last 11 years of his life, the Pope expressed the hope to conclude the revision of the breviary personally. This hope was never realized, and the projected reform was not revived by his successors. So, we'll have a little pause there, but it is the episode of someone who was very forward-thinking and rather unexpected at the time. But he was wise not to upset unduly and not to fix what wasn't really broken. I mentioned at the outset worship in spirit and in truth. Well, we can sum that up in the phrase liturgical piety. Let's look at some of the notions that come into this principle of piety expressed in liturgy. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, several individuals promoted liturgical piety, drawing one's spiritual nourishment from active and conscious contemplation of the faith of the Church, as it is celebrated and expressed in the liturgical rites and prayers throughout the annual round of seasons and feasts of the liturgical year, as distinct from the practice of an unrelated, however worthy, devotional exercise. Now, in Ireland, we have massively a church which runs on the devotional rather than the developed liturgical. It's very different in France and Germany. Just to be aware that if we're living in this part of the world, we need to be fully conscious that old habits die hard. And therefore, to get into the mode of true liturgical renewal, one has to look over one's shoulder a little. I remember when I got back to Ireland in 2007, initially in the first 5 weeks I was staying in the country in the area of Athboy, and the parish priest there would ask me to celebrate one of his weekend masses in those 5 weeks I was there. And I remember the unexpected comment after celebrating one Sunday morning at 9 o'clock in a country church. We are very conservative here. I thought that is ironical, because coming from the continent, one would be very much inclined towards bringing in a lot of singing and a certain understanding of liturgy, which obviously was very different from what was out there and which hadn't changed in some elements from way back. So I realized there pretty quickly how basically one can't change much quickly anyway in Ireland. It's a difficult thing to handle because conservative is not being used in the best possible sense, because one is conserving bad things. So just to be aware that it's complex, because to introduce the way of thinking which was really in the minds of those way back in the council years, to bring that into practical interpretation on grassroots levels, it needs a lot of catechetical work, and it's only mainly the stable parish priest who can do that. And if he hasn't done it, then many of the things that were actually pre-conciliar in different ways are still there. So it's a complex issue. For instance, this very weekend I was celebrating the Vigil Mass in a little church in the country, and I had someone from the continent with me that day, and although there was much edifying ways of doing things on certain levels, precisely because of the natural conservatism in Ireland, there were certain things which were actually quite surprising. How in practice in Ireland very few knew how to say how the responses, or certainly to sing any responses, and it was all basically left to the little choir up on the top in the tribune. So just interesting that things that we're used to shock people sometimes when they come from a different context, precisely where there has been more work done on participation in every factor. And in Ireland, in most churches still in Ireland, at least in the country, one will not be given a hymn book when one comes into church. It's interesting. And this is 50 years after the council. Now, the question then of the actual liturgy rather than devotional exercises, that is, being the centre. Now, a famous figure in Britain was James Crichton. He lists St. Giuseppe Tomasi, 1649 to 1713, as first among such proponents. At Tomasi's canonization in 1986, Pope John Paul II extolled his promotion of liturgical life. I believe that he was a cardinal as well, so he had a certain clout. So, Pope John Paul II extolled his promotion of the liturgical life, which ranged from the publication of research and scholarship to the work which he performed for the liturgical education of the people and of the simple faithful. So, other important figures would include the French Nicolas de Tourneau, 1640 to 1686, whose writings reflected his abiding concern that the celebration of liturgy should be an exercise of the mind and heart. We have an advantage in the public and fairly ornate Tridentine Mass that we have on a Sunday here nearby, at 1 o'clock there near Navan in Johnstown. It doesn't draw attention to itself because it happens, as it were, in automatic pilot mode. We know exactly what's going to happen, and there's no choir involved. It's all homegrown. In other words, we sing it ourselves. But it happens without having to be distracted by the correctness of details, but simply because doing it, as it were, automatically, one is not distracted by having to think about what one is doing. It works, and therefore one is free to fly within the celebration. The mind is engaged with God. The rest holds it up. If a liturgy is self-conscious, one isn't free to fly. The soul is linked too much to the body and to what has to be executed. So liturgy needs to free the mind and soul and not to shackle it. The Italian Ludovico Antonio Muratori, 1672 to 1750, he also combined liturgical scholarship with promotion of liturgical piety. And then the famous Rosmini, Antonio Rosmini, 1797 to 1855. I believe he founded the Institute of Charity, the Rosminians. He promoted active and conscious participation in the liturgy while rejecting actually the use of the vernacular. So obviously that was already being discussed in the question of liturgical piety. I remember being pleasantly surprised to see how in the Low Mass, in the Tridentine right now, even before the Council, one could be using hymns. It was only in the High Mass, that is the Missa Cantata and upwards, that every word had to be in Latin. One can, of course, say also the readings after they've been sung in Latin, but one can say them in English afterwards. That is encouraged. But in the Low Mass, the readings could be said only in the vernacular, in 1962 already. But the question of the use of the vernacular for hymns was quite open-ended, actually, already at that time. Therefore, hymns were coming in the vernacular. And those carried on in the years immediately after the Council. Hence it is that we still know well the golden oldies like Soul of My Saviour, Sweet Sacrament Divine, O Bread of Heaven, and so on. These old ones that were sung at the communion, which was quite long, because there was only the priest who would be distributing, or maybe other priests with him if it was a big celebration. But I remember when I was in school, those celebrations were, at Holy Communion, fairly calm, and we would have not one but two communion hymns, because of the calm nature of distribution of Holy Communion. This is something that we've lost by the hurrying up of Holy Communion in our time. It's a pity. But then these were hymns which were sung even by the people actually without books necessarily, because people knew them and they could still be used. In the same period, a significant range of books was published for the laity, encouraging them to follow the rites and prayers of the Mass itself. So rather than have people praying their own thing during the liturgy, the impetus already was to try and get them to pray the liturgy. Rather than devotional manuals, which would foster, for instance, the meditation of the Passion during the Mass itself. I remember seeing those around. You could find, I had one myself actually, it was the treasury of St. Anthony, that kind of thing. You had, with the text of the liturgy itself, you had ways to celebrate it mentally. The people could be following the Passion from the condemnation by Pilate up to the last breath and so on, dividing the moment of the celebration into corresponding parts. It was interesting and it was quite courant, but it was actually dissecting and separating the liturgy from its being prayed by the person in the pew. The thrust of the liturgical renewal was to get from that mode, that kind of mode. In Ireland, it would have been cut off from the Rosary, even actually said out loud in some celebrations on a weekday, I heard. From there to actually seeing what the liturgy was saying and engaging with it. So these books were well established by 1815, as early as 1815. Throughout the 19th century, publishing houses continued to produce editions of the Missal, the Breviary, and even the Pontifical for the use of the laity, so that there they would have notes to help them. The very availability of these volumes, and in some cases their prefaces, invited people already to that actual participation. Notice actual, not active, as the translation of participatio actuosa. So, their availability testifies to the way in which people were invited to this actual participation in the liturgy, about which the liturgical movement would have a great deal to say. Remember now, the liturgical movement was the whole thrust already from the early 1900s to the council years, which was to have as its end product Sacro Sacrum Concilium document there on the liturgy, and then which had to be applied by the Concilium immediately after the council. And indeed, traces of this can be found as early as the 17th century. England is an interesting case. Cardinal Wiseman, Nicholas Wiseman, worked to promote liturgical piety as a seminary rector and as a bishop from 1840 onward. Of the Missal, he had this to say: Catholics in general learn far too little of it, he says, and we do not hesitate to say that he who knows it not cannot have any idea of half the grandeur of his religion. Why, there is not a place or a thing used in the worship which he attends, upon which there has not been lavished, so to speak, more rich poetry and more solemn prayers than all our modern books put together can furnish. And of the use of parts of the breviary by the laity, he had this to say: "Such are the prayers which the Church has drawn up for her children, and for our part, we can wish for nothing better. We know not where an improvement could be suggested, and therefore we see not why anything should have been substituted for them." And so, even before the council, one did find, I remember actually it was in the treasury of St. Anthony, which I had there, which I was given when I was becoming a Catholic, way back. That was after the council now, soon after, but there was Compline in that, in English and in Latin. And the one who was my sponsor at confirmation, before the children of his family arrived, used to say Compline with his wife. So that's going back quite a bit in time now, and there would have been that hint that people could use some of the prayer of the Church. And also, remember, in quite a few places, especially on the continent, people would go to church a second time on a Sunday. They would go for the evening devotions, which in France would be les vêpres, Vespers, and with it would have benediction. I remember being present at one of those in Rouen in the years immediately after the council. It was well celebrated. By the way, that's also a great tragedy, that the evening service has completely gone from Ireland. It's very rare now to find evening devotions. Of course, what happened was that, first of all, the evening mass came in on a Sunday evening. That then made the other disappear. But then, at a later stage, that was transposed to Saturday evening. But the evening service did not take its place once again. It had gone, so we lost the evening service. And basically, the ordinary parish throughout Ireland only has one thing to propose. It's the Liturgy of the Eucharist itself. Of course, it's the summit, but it's on its own now. And we must remember that the completeness of the Church in its structure of praise and worship is like a sun. But the sun has its rays, and the rays are the other liturgical hours. So it's a pity that Vespers, with the sermon and with benediction, did not come in many places. It could have happened, and it would have been the wish of the Council Fathers. But then again, if it did come in, the danger would be that in some places it would be said. I've seen on the continent where it happens, it's sung, and it's easy to sing. It just needs one or two people who are able to lead it. It's not that difficult. This question of saying the psalms is self-defeating. It's just almost the devotional mentality coming back. The psalms are to be sung by their very nature. The very word psalmody implies that element of singing. It is done to an instrument like a harp in the classical times. Wiseman uses the language of a campaigner when he goes on to say that the family united in prayer should speak the very language of the Church, should observe the forms of devotion which she has herself drawn up and approved, and, as in good discipline, in spiritual affection, in communion of good works, in mutual encouragement to virtue, so likewise in the regularity and in the order of prayer, assimilate itself to those religious communities which in every part of the Christian world praise God in her name and under her especial sanction. We strongly suspect that many who will join the Church will hail with joy every such return, however imperfect, to the discipline and practice of the ancient Church. They will warm to us the more in proportion to our zeal for the restoration of its discipline. Now he knows what he's talking about there, because that is the ancient tradition of the Church. Now, we must remember the daily celebration of the Mass as we have it now is not as early as we might think. And therefore, the question of what happened at the morning and in the evening needs to be looked at. It's a bit of a cop-out to say he's a daily Mass goer. Great, that's fantastic, but here we have the sun. Are the rays there as well? There are people who are very hurried in their life. They fit in a quickie, the maximum, but what about the other bits? We're crashing in and out of eternity without the space that eternity needs to expand. So it is right and fitting that we prepare and that we conclude. The beginning of the day needs to start well, and we rest in the arms that made us. One day the Holy Curé of Ars was distributing Holy Communion, and at the altar rails he came up to one young lady who had been rushing to get there in a carriage and had not said her morning prayers. He knew it immediately and would not actually give her Holy Communion, because he whispered in her ear that she hadn't the preparation necessary without having said her prayers that morning. So he was aware that crashing at high speed into God is not the best way to encounter our calm and unhurried Maker. I'll leave it there for today, but let us bear this in mind. We need structure in our day, and the Christian centuries have had a peaceful structure. We find already elements of it in the Acts of the Apostles. Remember how they went up to the temple at the hour of prayer, being the 9th hour. Bits of antiquity have come into our life, and why should not elements still be there from what has always worked, and what will work again if we give them half a chance?